Bonsoir à tous et bienvenue pour cette rencontre qui clôt le festival Bibliotopia. Et nous sommes très heureux de vous voir donc pour la dernière fois de cette 5e édition de Bibliotopia, festival consacré au care, aux soins. Et nous allons nous aventurer aujourd'hui sur le territoire fondateur de la famille, lieu fondateur, lieu intime et littéraire par excellence, lieu de la souffrance pour certains, mais aussi peut-être du soin premier et du soin ultime. C'est la question que je vais poser et que l'on va se poser avec nos deux écrivains aujourd'hui. Salomé Kiner, bonjour, vous êtes journaliste et écrivain et journaliste. Et votre premier roman, Grande couronne, qui a connu un vrai succès depuis sa parution en septembre, c'est l'histoire à la première personne d'une adolescente en banlieue parisienne qui habite, je la cite, dans un lieu qui n'apparaît pas sur la carte, deuxième d'une famille de 4 avec une mère et un père, voilà, ça va être, je dis avec une mère et un père, puisque peu à peu, je ne dévoile rien, le père va prendre ses distances, ça va être un des nœuds du récit de la famille. Et donc, cette jeune adolescente qui a une langue qui porte le livre, à la fois légère, cynique, ironique, et
lighthearted, but also cynical and ironic. And we're going to hear her voice, Salomé, because you're going to read us a passage. This young girl is 13 or 14 when the book starts. She dreams of luxury brands and true love. And she's willing to do a lot to get that. And we understand from the beginning of the novel that she will go to great lengths to get these things. She experiences her sexual initiation. She makes her first foray into prostitution and then finds friendship, love, and care. And this is something that we see throughout the book. Later in the book, she's going to become the caregiver, the main caregiver in her family. She has a younger brother who's probably handicapped. It's not really explained. But this young girl is going to provide care for her young brother and is going to mature, and that's going to be one of the main subjects of the book. The family is a foundation, a solid foundation at the beginning of the book, and then it's going to have to be reinvented. It's sometimes funny, sometimes raunchy, and we will see the evolution of the family and this girl's relationship. Jean-Baptiste Del Amo, thank you for coming. Le Fils de l'Homme is your 5th novel. It reads, and your regular readers know this, like an incantation, sometimes harsh, sometimes flamboyant, which is really your trademark and makes you one of the most exciting writers of our generation. This same language was used in Animalia in 2016. For that, you won the Livre Inter award. Then you also wrote in 2008 in Éducation, Libertine, which won the Goncourt for the first novel. Le Fils de l'Homme opens with an epigraph from Thyestes, the dark tragedy by Seneca, one of the darkest and most nightmarish tragedies written in Rome. And it reveals the true nature of your novel because Le Fils de l'Homme, I think we can say it, is a tragedy. It's written in the form of a tragedy. And throughout the book, we are headed towards violence and a violent event which we can imagine from the beginning. The story is simple. A father, after years of being absent, comes back into the life of his son and the son's mother. The son has only seen pictures of the father, doesn't remember him from when he was a baby. The man has an aura. There's a shadow of violence around him, but also a certain virility, a certain social background, and a love story between the mother and the father. Life is difficult for the mother, who has been working to raise her child alone. She's a cleaner. She's exhausted, and despite the painful memories that she has of the father that we discover gradually during the book, she takes him back, and she agrees to go with him to the central place in the novel, Les Roches, which is an abandoned, very isolated house in the mountains, in the Pyrenees. It's very difficult to get to. This is a place where there's going to be a very tense relationship between the mother, the son, and the father in a closed scene where the son is going to open up to his father and to nature until the final confrontation between the son and the father, but I won't give anything away about that. Before we start to talk about your books, the title of the session is Families in Distress. As writers, do you share this opinion? Do you think the family is always a curse for its members, or, as your books may indicate, a source of inspiration that you come back to as writers? Salomé? Well, I think it's both. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's a curse, but it's an interesting aquarium for observing characters. It's ambivalent. There's love and hate, fatalistic and fluid. There are opposing forces at work in the family, and I also think that the structure is fascinating because it's a structure that's omnipresent. In general, when you have a family, that's a problem. If you don't have a family, that's a problem as well. It's natural because it's the first social environment that you're born into, and it's also completely artificial because it's just a group of strangers living together. So there are a lot of little novelistic effects that can come from that. And tension. Yes, Jean-Baptiste. Yes, I share that viewpoint. I think the family is an inexhaustible theater for a novel. It's the place that builds us, but it's also the place of silence, tacit transmission, and the unspoken. It is a universal subject. There's no. It's not by chance that the cinema and literature talk often about the family. I think that when we write about our families, we have to. We're responsible for what we write about our families. But often, on the other hand, when there's a writer in a family, it's very difficult. It can be a source of upheaval because it's difficult for people to explain why their son wrote such and such a thing about his own family. So it's tricky, and at the same time, it's a fertile ground for as far as stories are concerned. Salomé, we're going to listen to you read an excerpt from Grande couronne from about the mother, and perhaps we'll understand a bit more about her distress.
Ma mère avait les yeux mouillés quand elle s'est redressée, la petite main de Simon dans la sienne. Nous nous sommes fixés en silence, quelques secondes à peine avant qu'elle vienne s'asseoir sur le canapé, comme les vieux qui font un malaise. C'est rien, je suis fatiguée. Je suis vraiment fatiguée. Je suis montée à l'étage des chambres en caressant la rampe de l'escalier. La peinture était douce à force d'être touchée. Cette histoire de fatigue, je trouvais ça bizarre. À l'école primaire, la mère d'une fille était morte du cancer parce qu'elle avait trop attendu avant d'aller voir le médecin. Elle se plaignait du ventre, mais elle était débordée au travail comme à la maison. Ils appellent ça le surmenage. C'est quand, à force d'assumer le ménage des autres, on finit par se noyer dedans, faire des ulcères, et c'est là qu'on rajoute des préfixes à débordement. J'ai pensé à la mère de Chanel, à quatre pattes sous les meubles en noyer, à la mère de Kathleen qui dormait au salon à cause des bêtises de son père. Et j'ai décidé d'aider ma mère, et j'ai réparti les vêtements qui traînaient dans la salle de bain entre le panier à linge sale et leur propriétaire. Les jours suivants, je me suis occupée du lave-vaisselle à la fin de tous les repas. Elle me regardait faire en nettoyant l'évier. Quand je refermais la machine, elle rentrait les épaules comme si j'allais lui réclamer du fric ou le secret de la félicité. Je voulais juste savoir si ça allait, mais j'ai vite arrêté parce que j'ai remarqué que cette question aussi lui faisait venir les larmes.
Alors, en vous écoutant...
Well, as I listened to you read that, what struck me once again is how you really convey the voice of this teenager, or child, I suppose we could say. Would you say that Grande Couronne is a coming-of-age novel? And if so,
je pense que
what does the girl learn? I think that anyone writing a novel about a teenage character is writing a coming-of-age novel. As you said, there are a lot of firsts in her experience in the novel, sexual, in school, in her family, and with respect to friendships. I think what she learns first and foremost is a type of empathy. Her world caves in, her family collapses, her father leaves home, and she loses all her reference points. She observes adults, she learns from adults what it is to be responsible and what responsibility she'll have to shoulder, and then she has to become responsible for her mother later on. The book starts with a very harsh scene, and that's, I think, why the novel is so effective. Then we see how she's going to continue on her path. When you start off with such a violent scene, isn't it also a way of saying that she's going to have to learn a lot about the harsh conditions of life? Well, that's not why I did it, but your idea is interesting. Putting that scene at the beginning of the book was a choice. It wasn't so much about violence erupting in her life. It was about how you live with the scars of violence as such. This is a novel that I wrote in 2016, 2017, when the Me Too movement was gaining ground, and I was very much struck by the number of women who had been victims of violence, and I had never suspected. And it's fascinating to see how our traumatic experiences don't define us completely. They're not the only thing that forge us as individuals. So that's the reason why that scene is at the beginning of the book, because well, I'm learning more as I hear this about your interpretation. So there's a loss of innocence. Yes, absolutely, a loss of innocence. But I don't think she realizes that straight away, because she's preoccupied by other things. What she's interested in is buying designer goods, and all of the violence that she has to accept to get where she wants to go is something that she is willing to do. It's more humiliating to her to not have the same bag as her friends at school. So this is, she has to go through the violence to get to her consumer dream. So obviously there's a loss of innocence. Jean-Baptiste, your book opens with the return of the father to the family home. Since the Odyssey, the return is the end of the story. With the return of the father, the family gets a second chance. But for you, the return of the father is the end of a peaceful life and illusion of peace in the family. Why did you switch things around and make the return of the father the beginning of the tragedy? Well, very quickly, the plot is pretty much sketched out. I had three characters, a unity of place. The novelistic structure was fairly simple to arrive at, how to keep up the suspense. That was part of the plot. How could I give the reader to understand what happens before the return of the father? How the mother and father were with each other before. And I think that faithful chronology was not the best way to go. I thought that the best thing was to give the child a voice. He doesn't remember his father, and I wanted the reader to start at the same place. The reader is as surprised as the son to see the father appear. We don't know why he's there. We don't know what his motives are. We don't know why the mother agrees to follow him. And little by little, we discover things that have been in the shadows. So for me, that's how the structure of the book appeared. I felt that it gave the reader the motivation to continue reading. I was talking about a loss of innocence, but isn't there also a loss of innocence at the beginning of your book for the child? There's something of a lost paradise, but also for the mother who accepts the father even though she has to give a lot of things up. Yes, definitely for the child. We know that all children have to confront the reality of the world at the latest when they become adults, and the more books I write, the more I realize that it is this tipping point that I'm most interested in as a writer and that I want to explore, because I think that it speaks to everyone in a very intimate way. We have all gone through this moment where we realize what the weight of the world that we live in is. We don't all go through this at the same age, but at one point or another, we all have to learn this. And in symbolic terms, I think this tells us something about our collective humanity. I think there are two ways you can read the text. For me, it's a story, a story of the family, but I also wanted it to have the perspective of myth, symbolic take on what the human race really is. Salomé? Now let's talk about distress in the family, which is the topic of our session. In your book, the distress is mainly the mother's, and you recount it with the bittersweet language that characterizes the entire book. Would you say that you were trying to show the breakdown of a woman? Yes, well, when I heard you say distress, I was thinking of de-tress, unpicking, unraveling a family with the departure of the father, the sister who also leaves the family. There's something there in the sense of the glue that's gone, that's holding the family together. The mother's distress can be seen in several ways. Sometimes I see her as just going through a bad patch. She's just, some people see her as depressive, but I think she's going through a bad patch. But she's being seen through the eyes of her teenage daughter who wants to fall in love and who is looking for this love outside the house, in school or when she goes with men. And when she goes home, she has to face the failure of love because her father has left them for another woman. 13 or 14 is often an age where the solidity of the couple starts to fall apart. If there have been problems while they were raising the children, if it's been underlying, if it's been coming for a while. So it's quite common at that age to not only be experimenting with love, but also having to understand that your ideal of love may not be what's happening in your family. So the girl is at the same time discovering love, but also discovering how fragile love is. The girl has a very ambivalent attitude to her mother's distress. She's not angry with the mother as she is with the father. She sees the mother's distress is something that might threaten her. Maybe she puts herself in her mother's place. Yes, there's a certain feeling of solidarity, much more than with the father, who she's angry with. Here again, we come back to mythology, and it comes back several times. She talks about how women are always abandoned by men. For me, the book is absolutely. I'm one of several generations of unmarried mothers, and I know how difficult it is for women to meet a man after a certain age, how unfair the situation is when women divorce, that 85% of them have to raise their children on their own. Those are recent figures. It was worse in 1989. So women's lives are more marked by family responsibilities and motherhood or parenthood, which is a much heavier burden on women than it is on men in most cases. So I also wanted to depict characters that go through these things. Jean-Baptiste, your novel is not a psychological novel. The inner lives of your characters remains half in the shadows. For example, the mother, who is the most distressed character inside and also physically in the book. How did you decide to depict her slow decline if you didn't want to write a psychological novel? Well, as a reader, I've always had a fondness for characters with a large gray area. For the mother and the father in this book, I didn't want to approach them in clear-cut ways. I didn't want them to be all black or all white. I wanted them, for example, I didn't want the father to be a complete bastard, and I didn't want the mother to be a complete victim. It seemed a bit too obvious. I wanted them both to be a bit more in flux so that the reader would wonder or perhaps be uncomfortable. Why, for example, does she tacitly agree for him to come home? Could she kick him out? Or is she somehow self-destructive? Is that why she takes him back? So I wanted the reader to be uncertain. But the triangle of the three members of the family, it was obvious that true love could only be found through the mother. The father is not a complete bastard. He has some good intentions. He wants to regain the love of his wife. He wants to build a relationship with his son. That desire is always countered by his violent reactions. For the woman, for the mother, she's always a source of comfort for the son, a source of comfort and affection. But those are little pockets of time. The only time there's true happiness in the book are the moments of lightness and comfort and shared affection with the mother. When they swim in the mountain river, when they're together without the father, and when they're in fact together against the father. Yes. What's interesting is that we have a sense of the inevitable, that there's an invisible force directing the book. That's why I think we can call it a tragedy. But the inevitable is not where we might think it is, with violence that just appears from nowhere. But here we have a genealogy of violence. The father is more or less doomed to commit a violent act. Yes, I think that this character, like Salomé's character, are fighting a certain social and family determinism that is in part out of their control. They're only partly aware of their own motivations and their own drives. I tried to avoid making the novel unduly based on the psychology because I thought that the reader should also be only half blind, only half understanding these complex characters. And the father in particular is fighting his genealogical demons, his own childhood in the same house in the mountains with a father who was ill, crazy, and despotic, and which he's never been able to cut ties with, who he's never been able to cut ties with. The mother grew up in a small provincial town in a working-class family, and she probably had other aspirations. She had other ambitions, and perhaps even advancing above her social class. And this is why she agrees to give her husband a second chance, the father a second chance. She says, maybe we can find a new way of living. So, a second chance. So, both of them are looking for a way out of their existence. What about your narrator? Moving up the social ladder is what her main motivation from the start. Yes, and it's interesting because as I was listening to Jean-Baptiste, I was thinking that your characters don't have names, and in my case, they have several, sometimes two names, given names. I think that was my way of taking them, pulling them out of this determinism, taking them away from the problem of identity, which is often connected to our given name. That's the first thing that identifies us. And in Grande Couronne, when they switch from one name to another, they also can readily change identity. And social mobility goes through this as well. I never give the main character's real name, and she's called Tennessee as a nickname. So above and beyond social mobility, I think she wants to escape her roots. And find a better life, an easier life. But I don't think she really cares where she's going as long as she can get away from her roots. Do you think they know, they can imagine where they're going? It's almost as if we were predetermined to not be able to imagine our lives in any other socio-cultural category or class, almost as if there was a glass wall. Yes, as if we were all formatted. She has other aspirations, but she's blind. All she can think about is these designer brands. It's another form of social determinism.
When you say the place she comes from, what is it? Is it middle class living in residential suburbs? You spoke about her identity. We are made to understand that it's a Jewish family, but you never say so. They've done away with rituals. Is that it? Is it the failure of the couple, of the family? What does she try to escape from? As you said, we are made to understand that it's a Jewish family, although it's never said and it's never been passed on. It's a mixed couple, so there's a double cultural background, which is an experience which fragments the individual. You never know who you are. It also makes the narrator not fit in with the norm. She would like to be like everybody else, but she's the product of a mixed couple. And then there's the divorce, which fragments her even worse. So she'd like to go to a place that does not exist. They're rather lower middle-class family living in a residential suburb. They live in the Parisian Grande Couronne, so the second circle of cities that are still in the Île-de-France department but don't touch Paris directly. These places have evolved very much these 40 past years. They've lost a lot of their identity in these 40 past years. The place I'm talking about used to be the place where royal families had their secondary houses. With the demographic evolution of the Île-de-France department, it has evolved quite a lot. A lot of families settled there because of economic reasons without having an identity. So there is this process of acculturation, which they try and compensate by consumption. She wants to consume, and she wants to feel that she belongs somewhere. She wants to build her identity through her appearance. Jean-Baptiste, we're going to listen to you read. I spoke about the way you write, about the language, about your language. I think it's something that we have to listen to. It's much more streamlined than in previous novels, and I'd like to hear you.
N'a et n'aura jamais qu'un seul fils, et qu'il n'est pas le père de l'enfant porté par la mère. Il dit que la mère a trompé non pas sa vigilance, mais sa confiance, chose pire encore, car il n'a jamais, durant tout le temps qu'a duré son absence, imaginé qu'elle puisse un jour le trahir. Et s'il est une chose, dit encore le père au fils, de cette voix atone, sourde, erratique, une chose qu'un homme ne peut souffrir, c'est d'être trahi en amour. Sans doute le fils est-il trop jeune pour savoir ce qu'est l'amour, trop jeune pour même être capable d'imaginer ce que c'est que l'amour. Mais le père le met en garde de croire quoi que ce soit de ce que l'on raconte communément sur l'amour, les boniments, les fadaises qui sans doute remplissent les pages des romans pour bonnes femmes que lit la mère, avec cette avidité malsaine, complaisante, et qui peut-être ont fini par lui corrompre l'esprit. Non, continue le père de ce même monologue fantomatique, il ne faut rien croire de tout cela, l'amour n'est jamais animé que par le désir. L'amour n'est jamais que l'autre nom acceptable, celui-ci donné au désir, autrement dit à la convoitise, et il fait feu de tout bois pour obtenir ce qu'il convoite. L'amour est une maladie, un virus inoculé dans le cœur des hommes, ce cœur déjà malade, déjà pourrissant, déjà perverti, rongé de tout temps par la gangrène, et dont il serait vain de vouloir sonder le fond. Je te le dis aujourd'hui pour celui que tu deviendras plus tard. Garde-toi bien d'aimer, tu n'en tireras rien de bon. Car les hommes, plus qu'aucune autre bête peuplant cette foutue terre, naissent avec ce vide en eux, ce vide vertigineux qu'ils n'ont de cesse de vouloir désespérément combler, le temps que durera leur bref, leur insignifiant, leur pathétique passage en ce monde, tétanisés qu'ils sont par leur propre fugacité, leur propre absurdité, leur propre vanité. Et quelque chose semble leur avoir fourré dans le crâne l'idée saugrenue qu'ils pourraient trouver dans l'un de leurs semblables de quoi remplir ce vide, ce manque qui préexiste en eux, comme on comble d'une pelletée de terre le trou d'une fosse. C'est oublier trop vite que celle-ci n'a pas de fond, dit le Père, que cette plaie béante dans le cœur des hommes n'est jamais rassasiée, jamais pensée. On aime et on a l'illusion de la vie, on aime et on croit avoir trouvé un sens à tout cela, une raison, un ordre au chaos, mais l'amour en vérité nous infecte, nous corrompt l'âme et le cœur. Il faudrait tout aimer également ou ne rien aimer du tout, car placer tous ses espoirs en un seul être aussi faillible, aussi défaillant, aussi sournois qu'un être humain, portant lui-même en son sein un vide d'une profondeur aussi abyssale, ce n'est pas autre chose que de la folie pure, ce n'est pas autre chose que l'expression d'une totale désolation.
Merci beaucoup. Alors,
Thank you very much. It's a turning point in the novel. The father speaks more than he has spoken ever since the beginning of the novel, and as a reader, we realize that he may be possessed by something that is beyond him. Yes, this monologue happens in the middle of the story, and what remained in the shadow up till now, as to the motivation of the father, his history, the reasons for his return, is explained by this monologue on his love, his relationship to his mother, on his jealousy, on his personal story with his father, on his childhood in the exact same mountain. The childhood comes back to his mind when he comes back there and haunts him. It's a monologue. The father does not speak very much, and here it's a flow of words. You don't really know whether he utters those words or not. I wanted this to remain uncertain. The characters are working-class characters. They don't have the gift of the gab, and I realized writing this novel that the language had to be fairly direct, fairly popular, fairly colloquial, but on the other hand, I didn't want to restrict myself to this. I wanted to be able to give them a voice that would go beyond their social condition, and that's by reading Faulkner that the idea came to my mind. In southern states of the United States, where people are given names that are almost mythological in nature, there's something when they speak that goes beyond them. I was struck by this in Absalon, Absalon. And I thought I wanted to give this man the means of expressing himself beyond what he's able to say. And you hear this voice in the middle of the mountain, and as you read, you're wondering whether he's really uttering those words or whether the child is anticipating what the father might say. I really like this ambiguity. Ambiguity. I have a hard time pronouncing it at this stage of the day. And that allowed me to bring the novel closer to mythology. Salomé, there are also many instances of silence in your novel. It's a bit strange because the narrator, it's a stream of consciousness of the narrator, but then there's what she doesn't tell her mother, what she doesn't tell her family. She doesn't say anything about the double life that she leads from beginning till the end. I'm not spoiling anything by saying that she indulges in prostitution. Well, she stops in the middle of the novel. Doesn't she start again after that? No, absolutely not. And it's very close to my heart. It's not a novel about prostitution. Well, she sells herself. And so silence? Yes, silence. To me, It's more than silence. It's the lack of communication. It's what's characteristic of teenagehood, the fact that you are sure that the entire world does not understand you, whereas you understand the entire world. No one wants to hear you. No one wants to say you're right. And there's a gap, a dizzying gap. You're certain that you've understood everything, that you are right, and on the other hand, you are faced with people who don't want to listen to you. This is something that I've retained from my years as a teenager. You're in a place that sucks up all emotions and everything. You can't communicate with the outside world. If I may say something at this stage, we discussed this quite a lot, and I read the book. I felt there's a lot of discussions, and Salomé said no, and I realized that it's an I narrator. I was very struck when I read the novel. I'm very jealous of you because you managed to do something that I would like to be able to do. It's this ability to create a language of a teenager and to describe a decade of the past with lots of cultural references, and at the same time it's very poetic. What struck me very much with this novel is the melancholy. So there's this entire language that you invent that describes teenage years, and on the other hand there's a lot of melancholy, which makes it a very poetic text. Yes, you're absolutely right. And then there's the relationship to love. Her last love relationship is a melancholy relationship. It's really funny listening to you read. I thought that it's absolutely incredible. Both our books correspond to genre stereotypes. In the excerpt you read, the father is protecting his child from love, whereas in Grande Couronne, the only thing she dreams of is a white knight, or a knight in white armor. I think silence comes from the fact that these two aspects lock our characters up into stereotypes. It cuts them off from reality and condemns them to silence. They are so socially determined that they end up being isolated in a notion of what love should be or a notion of what love should not be. And I think that's what silence comes from. They lose touch with reality in both cases, in both our novels. And there no longer are any words. There's nothing there to name what they're experiencing because it does not exist. Jean-Baptiste, the child's silence is quite paradoxical. On the one hand, you can wonder whether he's silent because he's being devoured by his father. You said that there were very few moments of happiness except with the mother, but there's also the nature. Yes, there's the silence of the surrounding nature. Nature is almost a character in and of itself, and for the child, this awakens his senses, his sensuousness. This nature around him protects him, threatens him in turn. It's indifferent to the tragedy that's brewing. But for the child, it is a counterweight to the presence of his father. It's a kind presence. But there's also the silence when he faces his father. He's also a child who doesn't speak very much. In my previous novel, Animalia, the last child of the lineage, of a 5-generation lineage, chose not to speak. We don't know whether he's able to speak or whether it's a choice, but it was obviously because he refused to pass on the violence that had been his, that had come from his forebears. And there I had 5 generations over the course of a century, and in the case of Le Fils de l'Homme, I decided to use the same place, 3 characters, and I tried to see what I could come up with. But this silent child cropped up on me again. And to me, it's a way of refusing to convey toxic masculinity, which is what he inherits from his father. The mother is also relatively silent. She sometimes comes physically between the father and her child. She tries to be an obstacle to the father's violence with her body. Animalia, if I remember right, starts with birth. Sow, or rather a woman giving birth in a pigsty. Oh, sorry, I read it a long time ago, so it's not a sow giving birth, it's a woman giving birth in a pigsty. Yes, but there's a pig eating up the child. A true comedy. Well, yes, it was a very striking scene. It was very dark. And in Le Fils de l'Homme ends with a scene of birth again. Yes, I obviously have a problem with birth and giving birth, says Jean-Baptiste. You mentioned Seneca. Do you think your role as an author is to explore extreme darkness? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. To me, literature is a tool that helps us understand our humanity. And I'm pessimist at heart, and I think our humanity is characterized by violence, violence that's repeated time and time again, to the point where it will end up destroying itself. And literature is a way to transcend this. First of all, to explore it, to shed light on it, and to transcend this violence. As a reader, I've always looked for books that disturbed me, that shocked me, books that I sometimes had to close up again, not because of a violent topic, sometimes because of the style. The first time I tried reading Faulkner or Joyce or Antunes, there were books that I just had to put down. These are the books that I tend to go to very spontaneously because I think they will help me understand the world I live in. And as an author, that's the direction I try to follow. But with these horrible scenes, well, is Sade the kind of author that you like? Yes, reading Sade was fundamental as a teenager. I understood that literature made anything possible, that there was something in literature that was very poetic and that allowed us to explore bodies as the vessel of our humanity in its complexity. This really harnessed my imagination, like Eden by Guillotin. These texts had an seismic effect on me. It went beyond the boundaries of imagination. I said to myself, if there's a place that I can take advantage of, it's imagination, fantasy. Salomé, You quote Maupassant, and it's very interesting. You mention a short story by Maupassant that we've all studied in school called La Parure. The story of a woman who all her life will try to pay back a necklace that was actually worthless to start with. Is this a way of giving a moral dimension to the dream of your narrator? Well, I'm very happy because it's the first time someone mentions the moral dimension of Grande Couronne, because usually that's what bothers people. But I'd like to come back to what Jean-Baptiste said. I totally agree with you. Au-dessus du volcan was extremely important for me too. Under the volcano. People tell me, well, all the misery, the squalor, it's very distressing, it's very depressing. But for me, the book is rather funny. And to me, literature is also a source, a place where you can explore things. I wouldn't say that I'm a pessimist. I'd say that we're constantly confronted to the insufficiencies of life, but very often there are miracles, epiphanies, serendipity, and that's exactly what I'm looking for when I'm writing. I try to look for these miracles in all the darkness. The moral dimension that you mentioned a while ago, the prostitution ring she is part of, is the Magritte network, which comes from the Magritte painting Ceci n'est pas une pipe, because there's no penetration, only oral sex and masturbation. And I realized that the painting has another title, La trahison des images, the betrayal of images. And to me, that's exactly the topic of the novel, the betrayal of images. And I think that's what she learns. And to come back to your first question, she learns how to do away with images, with advertising. In the book, she's obsessed by suggested presentations. She goes to the supermarket, buys frozen fries, and she's sure that if she prepares her frozen fries following the instructions, she'll end up with the image on the package, which is that of an American family sitting around a table. So she's constantly looking at images in commercials, images of families, but also of women's bodies. And the more she buys and she consumes, the further away she gets from these images, because what she has to do wounds her along the way and prevents her from fulfilling the promise of such happiness. So you said all of this to answer yes to the question. Is that right, Salomé? Yes, well, sometimes you've got to take the long way. Turning towards the room, or turning towards the audience, are there any questions from the floor? No? No questions? I can't see any. So to come back to our topic, Salomé, we get the feeling, reading you, that the family could become a source of reconciliation, of comfort. That's something that we perceive in your last sentence. Is that right? I'd like to answer yes, but I'm not sure that would be right. Maybe I'll take the long way before answering yes. What I do think is that there's a U-turn It may not be the only place. What she was trying to escape, which is the family, is going to become a sort of shelter. And what she was trying to achieve, love, conventional type of life, is something that she is going to put as far away from her as possible. If I were to say that the family is a shelter, I'd be betraying my ideals, but I do think it's a place of potential reconciliation. So your answer is yes, maybe, right? Jean-Baptiste, the last scene of your novel does not promise that family will be the place for reconciliation. Yes, it's a little different in my novel. If we look at it symbolically, isn't it a way for you to tell us that the individual and the author has to leave the family, has to hate families? I don't know. I prevent myself from considering these ideas. I'd rather the novel to be a place where readers can project their own feelings. I can't say too much about the end of the novel because otherwise I'd be spoiling it. The only thing that seemed self-evident for me as I was writing this novel was that the child had to break with the cycle of intergenerational violence, but in order to do so, his only solution would be to use the same weapons as his father. That was really a tipping point in the plot. The end is fairly open. We don't really know what's going to happen with this child. We don't know whether he'll manage to escape the vicious circle of violence or not. So all interpretations are possible. One last question to both of you. From a literary point of view, are families something inevitable? Will you come back and explore families as a topic of your novels? Yes, absolutely. I can only write about families at this stage, childhood, teenagehood, but I think families, as an author, you tend to fumble around. You're constantly looking for your own language. You're always looking for topics that you can identify with. You have your obsessions, and these evolve over time. Some of these obsessions get solved over time as we grow old. But I think there are things, and you'll see this after a while, Salomé, that everything was already in an embryonic stage in your first novel. And as I go along, as I continue looking for a formal language that is my own, as I continue looking for topics that are the closest to my heart, I realize that family has to be at the heart of my writing and will probably remain at the heart of all my writing. Well, you started by mentioning the epigraph of Jean-Baptiste's novel, and my novel starts with an acknowledgement to my family. I think it's hard to avoid this kind of a topic when you're interested in a character. In anything I read, whenever there's a character, there's a family background, there are issues that have to do with the family because you're the product of your own family. I don't know whether it'll be a central topic in future novels, but I assume that'll be hard to avoid altogether. Thank you. Thanks to you both. And you'll be upstairs to sign the audience, books from the audience, and we can also have a drink all together. Thank you.